gentleman who's on the faculty here at the school to introduce our speaker, Stephen Cooke, who's going to talk to us about recreational fisheries.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you all for coming. The title, of course, is the Bevan series on sustainable fisheries, and sort of the subtitle is Frontiers in Fisheries where Sustainability Meets Reality. And I started sniffing around the website and scratching my head into the deep past, and it was started, I believe, by Bob Francis as a seminar series, and then Julia Parrish took it over and really was the force behind it for quite a good period of time. At some point, like Atlas, she shrugged, passed the weight of the world over to Trevor, and we're not quite sure how long he'll be holding the ball, but that's where things go. And I started looking over the names of people that have been associated with this series and wondering why there was a particular theme that was floating through my head. And I then read the subtext, which is the Bevan series examines the biological and social ramifications of our past, present, and future use of marine resources. And in some ways, I thought, we're just not getting a lot of freshwater stuff here. And I nagged Julia now and again, and was by and large dismissed. And so I tallied them up, and there have been 109 talks on marine topics and 6 on freshwater ones. And you can see kind of emblematic in the vessels here. And not only was I struck by the fact that it was dominated by marine topics, as you might say would be appropriate for the subtitle there, but there's something else that struck me. Look at these boats. Look at these boats there. There have been 98 talks on commercial fisheries of those that I could identify the particular theme, obviously things like oceans and all of 3 on recreational fisheries. Geez, that's a little bit slanted here. I went to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They tell me that there are 30 million anglers licensed each year in the U.S. on kind of a 5-year basis. It's about 60 million. And so I said, we need some talks on recreational fisheries. And I lobbied, I twisted Trevor's arm, and he said, okay, and I'm delighted to have nominated and introduced Stephen Cooke, who is shown here, not with perhaps a prime recreational species, perhaps it's a dark-skinned tarpon of some variety. Stephen is Associate Professor in Canada Research Chair. These are very, very prestigious chairs in Canada in fish ecology, conservation biology at Carleton University. So I went to his website, although he's the best way to get information, and he got his bachelor's degree from the University of Waterloo, PhD University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. He was then a Killam postdoc. These are also very prestigious postdocs that he held with Scott Hinch's group at University of British Columbia, and then assistant and now associate professor at Carleton University. And looking over his record, obviously we're trying to summarize something complicated, but in terms of scientific disciplines, a lot of work on physiology, a lot of work on behavior, although other subjects as well. Techniques, he's used a wide variety of techniques, although many of them have also involved radio, ultrasonic telemetry, so forth. A lot of interest in recreational fisheries, although other things as well. And all of these themes coming together in conservation and sustainability with a wide variety of fishes ranging from bonefish and barracuda, largemouth bass, sockeye salmon, freshwater and saltwater fishes. Very, very, very diverse record. I scanned his CV, and it listed 249 published papers. I said, that's got to be a misprint. This guy got his PhD 20 years after I did. It came along in 2011, there were 57 papers. In 2000, I more than a paper a week, with no time off for vacations. And there was 18 in press. I said, Christ. But then my thoughts changed from amazement at his productivity. I think, well, now, hold on a minute. Last week we had an introduction to Dave Armstrong, who was receiving all kinds of accolades for what a superior director he's been. I'm thinking, wait a minute. This guy was a postdoc at UBC, which is just past Northgate Mall, and we didn't hire him? What's with it? I'll take up no more of his time. Stephen, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. We're very pleased to have you.
All right, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. This is a fantastic school. There's not many schools, fisheries and aquatic science schools In North America, there's lots of biology departments and natural resource departments with the odd token fishy person, but it's really quite nice to be at an institution that realizes that that to truly advance science, conservation, and management, it requires having a number of people with common interests, and incredible, again, to be here. Today I'm going to be talking about global recreational fisheries. This is a pretty big topic, and something that in fact deserves more than simply the three talks that have come before this one, and I'm therefore not going to be able to cover it all. So I'm going to narrow and focus down a little bit as the presentation proceeds. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge what's essentially a co-author, a partner in crime, Robert Garlinghouse from Humboldt University in Berlin. He's somebody that I work with quite a bit, spend a lot of time fishing with, and so many of the ideas that I'm presenting here today were co-created, and we continue to work together. So this is the proper introduction in terms of where I come from. So it all started for me when I was about 7 years old. I inherited a tackle box from my grandfather, and started fishing in local ponds in and around Kitchener-Waterloo, where I grew up. At some point along the line, you start watching TV, and you see these fishing celebrities, and that's probably what I wanted to do first. Decided that it probably wasn't the best idea, though. Went to university, and I had aspirations. I wanted to be the local or regional fisheries biologist. And then I discovered this thing called research, which had incredible freedom, opportunity to explore the natural world. Went to school, became a professor. The most important arrow, though, is this one, because that's the arrow that lets me use research dollars to buy fishing gear. So, legitimately so as well. That's important. So what is recreational fishing? So as soon as you say fishing, people immediately think of rod and reel, but it doesn't just need to involve a rod and reel. That would be the angling component. Recreational fishing, here's the combat fishing in the lower Fraser. It can involve bow and arrow, so bow fishing, hand line. There's a rifle season for suckers in Virginia. You can use gill nets in the Chesapeake under a recreational license. Okay, so recreational fishing. I'm going to read this definition: fishing of aquatic animals that do not constitute the individual's primary resource to meet nutritional demands, and are not generally sold or otherwise traded on export, domestic, or black markets. Okay. Another thing to note is that recreational fishing tends to be the primary fishing sector targeting inland fish stocks, inland freshwater fish stocks in industrialized countries, and indeed, as we see countries such as Brazil, India becoming more developed, we're seeing greater emphasis on the recreational fishing component. Globally, from the countries for which we have data, and you can see there, although the white here is no data, so there's vast parts of the globe where we know zero about catch and release, or sorry, about recreational fishing. It's thought that 11% of the population participates in this activity. Globally, there's very little monitoring, even in the jurisdictions where they do have monitoring programs on recreational fisheries, and I would include Canada and the United States within that. Overall, we still do a pretty poor job. There's a lot of water to cover. Anglers are pretty diffuse and a hard group to keep track of. And there's evidence of growth in the recreational fishing sector in some of these emerging economies. Although we can piece together a general idea of where people are very into fishing, for example, Scandinavian countries in particular, we don't know very much about catch and harvest or fish that are released. There are a few countries that collect statistics that include that component. Canada conducts a national survey every 5 years where they look at not only participation rates and economic expenditure, but also species caught, the number harvested, the number released, and so on. The U.S. does it, but it's a bit spottier, and it tends to be, the marine surveys are arguably much stronger than the freshwater component, and they're separated. You have more government agencies here responsible for fisheries, so it's slightly more complicated. One of the things that Ian Cooke and I did a few years back was try and come up with some global estimates of where things stood with fisheries, because we simply could not go to the UN FAO and ask for this information because it's not really reported. In the last few years, their survey instrument has been modified. They're starting to ask more questions of the member countries in terms of rec fishing information, but still very little. So what we did is we took the information from Fishery and Oceans Canada's survey, which being Canadian, I'm going to say it's the best in the world, but it's not simply because I'm Canadian. It is the best data set in terms of both freshwater and marine recreational fishing that we have. We took those numbers and we simply scaled them up to the global level. That's wrong for all sorts of reasons, but just roll with me on it. If we do so, if people around the world fish as much as we Canadians do, then we would catch 47 billion fish on an annual basis around the globe. Of those, and these are the numbers of Canada, 36% of the fish in Canada are harvested. So the majority, in fact, are released. We're talking about 30 billion fish getting released, if that was the case. A harvested weight of about 11 million tons, and that compares to our commercial harvest of somewhere in the low 80s in terms of millions of tons per year. And that's commercial, inland, and marine fin fisheries combined there. So, the number of fish is staggering. The actual mass, not massive, but nonetheless, clearly something that we should be thinking about and keeping track of. Is it that big? Probably not. There's certainly many jurisdictions where few, if any, fish are released. So a couple interesting stats here. First of all, in the United States, 88% of people have gone fishing at least once in their life. And then this is really the slide that does it for me and shows that fishing is important. When Denny Brower found his way onto the front of a Wheaties box. He's a fairly famous bass angler. I'm trying to figure out this filter. All right. In terms of recreational fishing, there are a whole suite of benefits. The economic ones are fairly obvious, and Dr. Quinn mentioned some of those in his introductory remarks. Just to put an individual fish in context, in the Florida Keys, where they have a decent information on the size of the bonefish population, as well as good economic information in terms of the economic value of that fishery, it's estimated that a single bonefish is worth $17,000 US over the course of its life. Okay? These fish are valuable, incredibly valuable. In terms of what we get out of fishing, social bonding with family and friends, increased quality of life and so on, psychological stress relief, it's nice to be out in nature, reduce negative emotions and so on. I think you're probably all familiar with the idea of being hooked on fishing, not drugs. So this idea that we can focus youth on more nature-related activities, and then this whole idea of the last child in the woods and nature deficit disorder and so on. And so fishing is a good way to expose youth to those activities. Of course, anglers can aid in environmental monitoring. They can report violations that they see while they're out in the field. We also end up with an engaged citizenry that are voters as well, very important. They provide important information on fish in certain situations. They know more about biologists in some cases in terms of the fish that occur in a given system. We can hand them an angler diary and they can actually report information back to management agencies. And of course, if fish can be captured and released in a manner such that they survive, then we, of course, can catch those fish over and over again. It's, of course, though, not a free lunch. Back in 2002, John Post published a paper that is, I believe, the most cited of all the recreational fisheries papers out there. And I would note that for a special issue of a forthcoming journal, he's actually prepared a revision of this. So we're going to have an update, which will be quite interesting to see. But the authors essentially identified 4 high-profile fisheries that showed declines that were attributed largely to recreational fisheries in Canada, and they'd really gone unnoticed. And these were for walleye, lake trout, rainbows, and northern pike. And some of the reasons why these declines went unnoticed dealt largely with the fact that there's complex angler behavior. So this is work done by Carl Walters and John Post this idea that when anglers drive down fishing quality in one system, they simply jump to another one, and then when fishing gets poor there, they jump around. So those complex angler dynamics were things we hadn't considered or thought about previously. The lack of long-term monitoring is the number of river and lake systems in North America, especially if you live in places like Ontario or Minnesota. It's really impossible to monitor, and anybody, I know there's some government agency folks in this audience, any long-term monitoring, it's difficult to obtain funds to do that. And then, of course, the stocking, the fact that any time a fishery isn't doing well, you back up the hatchery truck and dump in more fish, and the problem is solved. So they concluded that recreational and commercial fisheries aren't that different, and that's something that really got Ian Cooke and I thinking. And we moved forward with contrasting recreational and commercial fisheries in this paper here. And we were thinking that if anglers and if rec fishers and the commercial sector could actually work together, there's a lot of common conservation issues that they could approach in a more coordinated fashion. But in doing so, we noted that there were a number of issues such as environmental pollution, problems with overharvest, evolutionary impacts, and so on. So we're starting to notice a mounting number of environmental and sustainability issues. And at the same time, and it was really about this time that Robert and I started collaborating, Robert's group in Germany put out a paper on the documented potential biological impacts of recreational fishing. So 2 review papers in 1 year that pointed out a fair number of potential issues. So here they are, and there are others, of course. So we've got environmental impacts, the disturbance of being in a system, and that's everything from trampling bankside vegetation, walking through redds, driving boats that create wakes that affect water birds and so on, litter, lead from fishing sinkers, line. There's some interesting papers that show the damage caused to coral reefs from fishing line and lures, the pollution, some of these could be arguably called pollutants, the stocking, the introduction issues, and I'm sure you've heard about some of those from Julian Olden, bait harvest, all sorts of interesting issues, population declines I mentioned, the evolutionary consequences, conflict, and the welfare issues associated with the anti-fishing movement. I'm going to focus on this last one, and I'm going to do so because it actually allows me to also weave in some of the information on catch and releases as well, some of the catch and release science. And it's also sort of a contentious topic, something that a lot of people spend time thinking about. Is fishing an acceptable activity? If I'm an angler, how should I handle that fish so that it's released in a manner so it's likely to survive and so on. So fish welfare, growing interest in the topic and recognition among fishery scientists that it's something we need to think about. There's been a number of recent reviews. I would point out that recreational and commercial fisheries certainly lag behind the aquaculture industry and the sector as a whole in terms of acknowledging and addressing fish welfare issues. And I would submit that most anglers and fisheries management agencies have failed to adopt a proactive approach to fish welfare, and it's perhaps associated with confusion with some of the other philosophical perspectives that exist, and I'll clarify what I mean by that. So, as soon as I say animal welfare, what many people jump to in their head are ideas such as animal liberation or animal rights. And they're very different. So, as you can see in the animal welfare paradigm here, fish certainly don't have rights, but you can still kill and eat them, you can still catch and release, you can still manage them, recreational fishing is still acceptable, and so on. As you move to the animal liberation column, you can see that we can't do any of those things, and if we move to the animal rights column, it jumps up a step, and then those fish actually have rights as well. So this is something that most people don't know. As soon as you say animal welfare, they immediately jump to the other end of the spectrum, and that's problematic. And that's, again, not just anglers, it's scientists, it's the management community as well. So there's an anti-fishing movement out there. PETA is certainly at the forefront of that, but there are other organizations well. And as I noted, most anglers equate welfare with anti-fishing. And that, again, is not the case. It's more about how one does it as opposed to not doing it. One question you might ask is this discourse limited to what we'll call fringe elements? And the answer is no. So Eugene Ballon, who was the longtime editor of Environmental Biology of Fishes, in his swan song when he retired from the journal, the last paper that he put in there, he wrote, "Catching live fish on hook and line and other than for food, i.e. pleasure, leisure, sport, or competition, is an unethical, deplorable, and undignified activity of humans." Okay? And then down here, another journal article, "On moral grounds, fishing for subsistence might be acceptable, while angling, including catch and release, may not." So there's people postulating that recreational fishing is an unacceptable activity in the peer-reviewed literature. In 2006, the Fisheries Society of the British Isles assembled a position paper that was turned into a review paper in the Journal of Fish Biology. The lead author is the president, or was at the time, the president of the Fisheries Society of the British Isles, Felicity Huntingford. In that paper, which was largely an attack on recreational fishing, there were a number of problems. First of all, in the paper, they completely separated fish from the social ecological system in which we operate. Second, they failed to provide any examples of the positive actions that had already occurred in the sector. Lots of examples of how things had improved in the aquaculture sector, but it really painted the recreational sector in a bad way. And really the only conclusion that one can come up with after reading that paper is that catch and release angling is harmful, and catch and release in particular, and it must be stopped. This is where Robert and I and others came together. We challenged the paper. Our challenge was unsuccessful when we submitted it to the Journal of Fish Biology, so we submitted it to the top journal, Fisheries, and it was published. And then they challenged us in there, which I thought was interesting. At any rate, the definition that Huntingford uses in their paper is what we call a feelings-based definition. Okay? And that's that the good welfare is the absence of suffering, whatever suffering is. We've argued for a function-based definition, which we provide in our paper, and then we proved it in this IFAC Code of Practice. And a function-based definition is that good welfare means that an individual fish is in good health, with its biological systems functioning properly, and with no impairment of fitness. We've continued to banter back and forth in the literature with Felicity and colleagues. We put in a paper in 2009 where we contrasted what we call the pragmatic approach. So this is where the basic assumption is that recreational fishing is morally acceptable, and that was the approach that we were arguing for. And then the approach that Felicity and others have argued for is the suffering-centered approach, where the basic assumption is that recreational fishing or some of its practices are morally unacceptable. So again, this volley continues in the literature and at conferences and so on. So in Europe, there certainly has been a lot of movement in this front. In Germany, there's bans and constraints and debates on use of live bait, fishing competitions, voluntary catch and release, various holding practices, and so on. Angling examinations are required by law, so to get a fishing license, you have to take a course. In the Netherlands, the Party for Animals has 2 seats in Parliament, and although it's not enough to push a motion through, they've advocated to ban barbless hooks. In Switzerland in 2008, they also banned voluntary catch and release and use of live bait fish, as had occurred in Germany. There's also a ban in barbed hooks, and again an angling exam. And in Scandinavia, there's a lot of debate, in Norway in particular. So I just want to go into the German example in a little bit more detail. It's the one that's been in place the longest, and with Robert there, we know the most about it. So it's the German animal protection actually falls under part of the Constitution, Article 20A, and it's contained also in some local fisheries regulations. And basically it says, reasonable reason is needed to inflict pain, suffering, or damages to animals, and fish are animals, and so they were therefore included in this. Reasonable reasons include, so you still can go fishing, harvest for food, or maintaining ecological balance. Okay? So, it is a little bit more complicated than that. So there are reasons why one can release a fish in Germany and do so without fear of prosecution. For example, if there is a regulation in place that says that fish under 12 inches long must be released, well then you can release the fish, and that is acceptable. If you catch fish that are protected or endangered or otherwise, you must also release that fish. That would be acceptable. Bycatch can be released. This one's interesting. So when you're fishing and the conservation officer comes up to you, what you tell that individual in terms of what you're fishing for could have implications. So if you're out there and you would like to release all your fish, you need to really think about what you tell people that you're fishing with and fishing around you. Unprotected sizes and species should or must be harvested. So this is basically telling you, if you catch a fish that's legally harvestable, you need to harvest it. Okay? So in terms of how this works in practice, not only can conservation officers enforce this legislation, but individuals can as well. So there's people that are passionate about people not releasing fish in Germany. They troll websites, they go to common fishing sites, they can obtain evidence, and then they can charge you as an individual and actually take you to court. So an individual can take another individual to court under this legislation. This is Yvonne Schoner. It's actually Robert's ex-girlfriend. She's a movie star of various types in Germany. This was taken during a trip when they went to Spain to catch Wells catfish. And it's quite a big fish. And Robert actually took the photo, and at some point, as all photos do, they find their way onto the internet. And this one found its way onto the front page of the Bild newspaper, which is an important newspaper in, it's got about 10 million readers a day in Germany. She received hundreds of letters after this was shown, and even death threats. And so the article is basically about how evil she is for catching and releasing that fish. There were attempts made, lots of lobby to get her charged for this practice, but they were unsuccessful because this capture and release event actually took place in Spain. So she was safe in that respect. So anyways, an interesting example. So one might ask, what leads to anti-fishing perspectives? So in a number of US states, and these are data from Thiel and Manfredo, as well as in Germany, those are data that Roberts collected. When you ask that statement, or agree with that statement, angling for fish for sport is cruel, here's the % agreement, and you can see that there's a correlation with the degree of urbanization. I'd like to see more data points here, but it makes sense. The idea that as we end up with people living in more urban centers, disconnected from nature and sort of the traditional rural livelihoods that where we might think that people are more likely to be engaged with natural resources, we can see an issue developing, particularly as in North America we continue to move to more urban centers. So in terms of how to move forward with catch and release and fish welfare, this is what I sort of call a proactive prescription. So first of all, we need to recognize that all angling causes injury and some level of physiological disturbance. It's impossible to catch a fish without injuring it with a hook. You are injuring a fish. And it's impossible to land that fish and handle it without causing physiological disturbance. Okay? Except that it's irrelevant as to whether fish feel pain and have the capacity to suffer. Let's for now just assume that angling is a legitimate activity. I would point out that we have a paper that is in review right now where we suggest that any papers that have claimed that fish have the capacity to feel pain, that we in fact dispute that and suggest that in fact those papers have a number of serious flaws. We can perhaps talk about that later. I can't get into it much more right now. 3, recognize that there are simple things that can be done to minimize the impact of angling on fish welfare. And the selling point for me, if I'm going to an angling club and trying to talk about fish welfare, is that what's good for the welfare of individual fish benefits the fish population and the same fishery that they're operating within. So to me, fish welfare is part of a whole management scheme, really. what I want to talk about for the rest of the presentation here is really number 3, that there are things that can be done to minimize the impact of angling on fish welfare. If you take a fishing event from the time that a fish is hooked to the point that it's released, there are a whole bunch of things that happen to that animal, the fight, landing, and eventual release. There are a bunch of things that mediate that event, such as water temperature, presence of predators, and so on, and then a number of possible endpoints. And of course, the target for catch and release is that you release a fish that recovers, no fitness effects, no disease, minimal injury, minimal stress, and that it survives. And so our lab and others have been poking away at various points, trying to understand what components of this event, of the fishing process, can be refined to ensure that we end up with this appropriate target. And so to that end, we've developed some generalized guidelines. We can't go out and do a catch-and-release study on every species and every system. That's called stamp collecting. But there's certainly some really interesting things that we have noted, differences between males and females, differences between populations. So it's certainly more complex than simply saying, oh, a salmonid, we'll do salmonids, and we'll do centrarchids, and we'll do perchids, and so on. So some of the generalizations that we think can be made would be minimize angling duration, minimize air exposure, these are fish after all, and improve handling. Select terminal tackle to improve the outcome of the angling event. Barbless, hook type, bait type, leaders where appropriate. Anything that really results in shallow hooking, that's the biggie. Avoid angling in extreme environmental conditions, so when water temperatures are really high, or in habitats that are really difficult, such as high predator burden or great depth. And then avoid angling during the reproductive period, because fish should be focused on something else. This is really about gear choices, regulations, and angler behavior, which is something that can be difficult to change. So I'm going to go through some of the things that we know, some of the general patterns that have emerged in the literature, and use some examples from our own work as well. So here's just a generalized schematic. We see that catch-and-release mortality rate is strongly related with water temperature, and I can take this plot and do it for largemouth, striped bass, and Atlantic salmon. Those are the species for which we have enough data to populate such a graph. And the only thing that's different is where the exponential relationship really takes off. For example, in largemouth bass, this is probably around 26 degrees, and in Atlantic salmon, that would be about 18 degrees. So every species that's been studied seems to have a thermal threshold, and after that threshold, things tend to go poorly. What about gear? What can we change with respect to gear? So back in 2004, we did a review of the circle hook literature. So this is a circle hook, and this is a conventional J-style hook. And you can see here, with a circle hook, the point of the hook is perpendicular to the shaft, as opposed to over here, the point is parallel to the shaft. So the premise is that if you're fishing with live bait, a fish ingests, like it would a food item, in the esophagus or even into the stomach. You apply pressure. It's not a violent hook set. You apply pressure. It comes out because this point is not pointing outward. But just due to basic physics, it wraps around the jaw. So you end up with fairly shallow hooking compared to the same fish. If you set the hook when that hook was in the belly with a J-style hook, you would hook that fish in the gut or the esophagus. And you can see here, there's roughly, on average, there's a 50% reduction in mortality when circle hooks are used relative to conventional hook types. There are some subtleties here. For example, if we use the billfish in Florida as an example, Eric Prince did some work that showed that if you simply take the circle hook and offset it, 15 degrees was a severe offset, 7 was a minor offset, but at 15 degrees you essentially turned it into a J-hook again. So there's some subtleties there. And so the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Council, which is one of the first groups to actually use circle hooks in a regulatory framework for recreational anglers, they spent a lot of time trying to define a circle hook. because to enforce a regulation you have to have very clear definitions. So they had to go to the point where they identify which brand and which model number to use. And this is what a circle hook looks like. That's bluefin tuna off Prince Edward Island, and this is a muskellunge in the Ottawa River. And so you get that corner jaw hooking. That's very typical hooking location. As I mentioned before, the strongest, there have been a number of meta-analyses done, and the strongest single predictor of short-term or immediate mortality is hooking depth. So anything you can do to get that hook placement in the mouth as opposed to deeper reduces mortality in a very big way. Should we use barbless hooks? This is a question that anglers often ask, and many management agencies wrestle with this question. The reality is that there's not much strong evidence, in fact, very little evidence to support the fact that use of barbless hooks reduces mortality. A mixed marine fishery, 15 species in the Gulf of Mexico, no difference in mortality. A meta-analysis of non-anadromous salmonids, no significant difference in mortality. Nonetheless, myself and others continue to promote barbless hooks for one reason alone, and that's that it's easier to get a fish off the hook and release it. So you reduce handling time. That's particularly important in warm water conditions and such. So anything we can do to get that fish back in the water more quickly, the fish is better off. So it's not because it reduces mortality directly, but we do think there's a potential physiological benefit, so perhaps an indirect contributor to reducing mortality. What happens to a fish that breaks the line? A fish, you've got a fish on, and boom, all of a sudden you swam away with your with a $15 lure in its mouth. What happens? We've actually done those experiments with pike and barracuda. We haven't worked up barracuda data yet, but here's a pike that we released with the Germans call these gummy baits. A gummy bait in its mouth. It's a soft plastic lure. And what we found out that the only real difference is that pike that had the lures were more active during the first 12 hours following release. So they swam 6 times further than our control fish. We've also tagged the lure because the problem here is we never knew when the lure and the fish separated. So with pike again, we've got a more extensive study, and again, I've got a part-time graduate student that's not being real quick with getting that written up. So why should we minimize air exposure? This is something that's important. I try to the best of my ability to make sure that most of the photos on my web page look like this, where there's water still dripping off a fish if we're showing a fish in air, and I would suggest that it's a good practice for all of us that are fishery scientists. There's lots of inexpensive underwater cameras that you can get now with GoPros, and you can get some fantastic shots that are way cooler than I think than hoisting a fish up above your head. So why air exposure causes a number of problems. The gill structures collapse. They stick to each other. They become dehydrated. Massive bradycardia, hypoxia associated with an associated physiological disturbance is loss of equilibrium and impaired swimming ability. There's a whole bunch of papers that suggest that air exposure for fish is bad. Here's an example. This is from work that we were doing on bonefish in the Bahamas. There's half a bonefish. That was Sasha's master's project. And you can see at the top here, we had fish that were released that had equilibrium at time of release. We had those that lost equilibrium. And the fish that were released without equilibrium were 6 times more likely to suffer predation. And that wasn't simply throwing them upside down and just sitting back and watching the sharks come in. That's after we revived them and then released them. Okay, so that effect of that fish losing equilibrium carried over later. And you can see here, this is within an hour of release, about 35% of those fish had been chomped by sharks. We like to chase them down. This is a great opportunity to get otoliths. So, should a net be used to land fish? We've done a number of studies comparing different net mesh types. For folks that work with fish commonly, this is common sense really, but rubber nets or the knotless nylon nets are far better. The reality is that when you go to tackle shops, the nets that they typically have, at least the inexpensive ones, are those that are knotted nylon, and they just rip fish apart. So there's still some more work that needs to be done to get the right nets into the stores. And we suggest that nets should really be used where it's essential to control the fish, either to protect the fish or to protect the angler. What about lip gripping devices? Has anybody seen these? These have come onto the market in the last few years. Very popular in the southern U.S. where there's marine waters, where there's more toothy fish. So basically this lip gripper is used, and you can hold the fish with the gripper and, instead of sticking your finger into its mouth because it has teeth. There are a number of organizations that were suggesting that this device should be used for bonefish. So Bonefish and Tarpon Trust wanted to know whether that was a good idea, so we did a very simple experiment where we held fish with these devices, and then we had our controls, and you can see here the type of damage that's done by these devices. So again, companies are marketing them saying, hey, this device is really good for fish, use it, lots of conservation benefit. I would suggest that's not a conservation benefit for the fish. I do want to mention that it probably varies with mouth morphology and dentition and so on, the thickness of the tissue. So it's not as straightforward as they should never be used, but they certainly need to be evaluated before they're used on all fish species. So another question one might ask is there anything that I can do as an angler after I've got a fish, especially if it's exhausted, to help that fish recover, to help it get back to normal conditions? And so this is a very salmon-friendly audience, I would suspect, so I have to throw some salmon data at you. So these are some experiments that we've been doing in the Fraser River, British Columbia over the last few years. And we know from the literature that when we expose fish to flowing waters or force them to swim at slow speeds, that it actually facilitates physiological recovery. These boxes are actually required in marine waters when fishing with gill nets. In case you encounter a coho salmon, commercial fishers are required to put them in there to help facilitate recovery. So we wanted to do the same for anglers, but obviously an angler is not going to haul that around along the shoreline, along the riverbank. So we investigated these bags. These bags are open on both ends with mesh. There's a zipper in the top, and they collapse. They cost about $75 each. In the lab, when I say the lab, I mean Weaver Creek, we compared 3 flows, static, low, and high at various time points, and we used that to identify that 15 minutes at high flow reduced the cortisol spike. We didn't see a cortisol spike like we did with the other treatments and controls, and improved vigor, so we selected that threshold, so 15 minutes in the bag and decent flows. And then this is what they look like when they're deployed. You just take a bit of rebar, hammer it into the substrate, and then you've got your bags coming off the back. So again, something that anglers could do. And we took this experiment to the riverbank. So we've got the treatment up there. So we had angling fish where we captured them, tagged them, and released them. And for tags here, these were radio tags. We had a second group where it was angling plus air exposure. So these fish were more exhausted. Same thing, tag and release. The angling plus recovery into the recovery bag and then released. Angling air exposure recovery, and then a beach seine as a control. It's the best control we've come up with. And this is work done on sockeye. And what you can see here are the survival rates to the Thompson confluence, which is just a convenient migratory bottleneck. And you can see here, here's just our angling treatment, and we've got the black is no recovery and the white is recovery. And you can see here that there is actually a bit of a penalty for the fish that were angled and put into the bag, whereas those fish that were angled and air exposed, there was quite a significant benefit from holding those fish in the recovery bag. And we've got our control values over here. So again, it looks like the kind of thing where recovery bags are potentially useful, but you only need to use them when the fish are truly exhausted. If you hold fish that aren't exhausted in those bags, you in fact may exacerbate problems. So one of the questions, of course, is would anglers use recovery bags? We showed this to managers, and they nodded and said, interesting, but would anglers ever use this? So at the same time, we had a human dimensions study underway that included questions on recovery bag adoption and catch and release science in general. Here's some information from that component of the of the study. We had 23 that provided a negative protest, so that's basically where they refused to answer it all. They thought it was a stupid question. Negative legit was they had negative feelings toward the use of recovery bags and provided a legitimate reason to back that up. For example, I don't have the time, it's too expensive, and so on. 4.5% neutral, 27% positive, but with a condition, if you gave it to me for free, for example. And then 25% were fully positive. And then, so we have more than 50% that said that they would voluntarily use the bag if it worked. So that's interesting. We didn't have to necessarily use a regulation. If it worked, 50% of them would voluntarily adopt it. If mandatory, most said that they would bring it to comply, but they wouldn't use it. So we still had 24% that were supportive. So we found this fascinating to combine the human dimensions component with the actual biological component. So of course we need to disseminate the right information. We can write journal articles, and we do, and they sit in shelves in libraries or online in cyberspace. But we need to get the information in the hands of those that can use it. Really, we're talking about the anglers, the angling community. And so we can develop things like this. We worked with Fisheries Conservation Foundation, which is the outreach arm of the American Fisheries Society, and Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, to produce this brochure. Instead of just telling people what to do, we told them what not to do. So we have examples of bad practices, bad versus better, and good. So, just to be real crystal clear as to what behaviors we thought were the best. And I want to point out at the top here, this is interesting, had an undergrad student mine all the fishing regulation guides that are produced by the various state and provincial agencies in North America. And every single one of them has in it a brief synopsis as to how to catch and release fish. And we looked at them and we found that there was a good number of them that actually had bad practices identified. So we actually have government agencies advocating for bad practices when it comes to catch and release. So a number of agencies, I know 3 in Canada, have revised their regulations based, or not the regulations, their guidebook based on that study. But what's also important is getting information out in the right way. And so I'm going to take you back to another one of Vivian's human dimension studies on the Lower Fraser. Another question that she asked questions about how information is obtained by anglers and how they would best like to obtain information on how to best handle fish. And so it turns out that the internet and interpersonal interaction when fishing is how they usually got their information, but it isn't how they wanted to get it. It wasn't their preferred method. We used something called latent class cluster analysis to identify the preferred methods. And we found three clusters. We call the first one traditional. This is basically anybody that doesn't use the internet to find that information, and that's how they want it. So any form but internet. Investigative are folks that will track it down on the internet, regulation books, or the media. And then the final group was networking, which are folks that would go to tackle shops, other anglers, or government staff. And in fact, a surprising number indicated that they wanted conservation officers to show them how to handle fish. So we thought that was a little bit surprising. The fact that we have heterogeneous communication preferences really complicates things for managers. So it means you can't just produce a brochure and leave it at the tackle shop and assume that you've gotten the message out. That's not the case. I'd also like to point out that there was fairly strong support for mandatory angler education programs. Again, have that coupled with the fishing license. Of course, there was a big caveat, and that's that everybody that has a license now would be grandfathered. A lot of them wanted that. In terms of a document that brings all of this together, I'd just like to point out that the European Inland Fisheries Advisory Commission has put together a code of conduct document that Robert Ian Cooke and I helped develop, and more recently that's been incorporated into a UN technical guideline document on recreational fishing, working with Brett Johnson as well here. And that's just in the final phases and will be published early this year. So the hope is that that document will get out and get in people's hands and government agencies and anglers' hands. It has a lot of useful information there about recreational fisheries management and how fish should be handled. One of the problems with all these welfare issues is that fisheries management is focused on populations and stocks, not individuals. When we're talking about welfare, we're really still, we're talking about individuals, what you can do for that individual. But I would like to point out that it's increasingly recognized that individuals matter in a couple ways. First of all, the notion that we need to throw back the big ones, the fact that cryptic mortality from individuals contributes to population, or may be sufficient to contribute to population declines. And then finally, evidence that vulnerability to angling is indeed heritable. And so it's possible for anglers to actually impart evolutionary consequences on fish populations. So individual welfare matters in that context. In terms of the way forward, basically suggesting that management agencies take a leadership role in identifying what science needs to be done and producing information to get in the hands of anglers as to how to best do that, making sure they're disseminating the right information, and adopting the code of practice. And then for anglers, recognize that they are a target. Right now, there is a group out there that wants to see angling eliminated, and if we continue with the status quo, there's a good chance that'll happen with continued urbanization, as more people feel that fishing is an inappropriate activity. Consider the welfare status and realize that they're really the ones that impact what happens to the fish, and that they're the ambassadors for the sector. I hope the message that I've gotten across is that the fish welfare is not anti-fishing. In fact, it's the solution. There's lots of opportunity for celebrating the successes that we've already had in reducing mortality and improving the welfare of fish that are caught and released. We need to continue to work along those lines. And I want to end with this point, that we need to engage youth more, the next generation of recreational fishers early on, to make them excellent stewards of our resource and part of an environmentally informed and engaged public. Thank you very much for your time.
Time for some questions. I'll hand over to Stephen to pick and choose.
Yes, sir.
You really didn't say too much about what I would call trophy fishing for marlin and sharks.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any justification for that?
Justification. Well, one could use all the benefits I provided as the justification.
Besides the economic benefits.
If there's biological information that can be obtained from that fishing. If studies have taken place that identify that that can be done in a way such that those fish can be released in a manner that they survive, then great. And in fact, the Billfish Foundation and NOAA and NIMS and so on have done a fair amount of work along those lines. And as long as circle hooks are used, mortality rates for released billfish are actually quite low. We know very little about the fate of sharks that are caught and released using recreational angling gear, so that's something that certainly deserves further attention. Yes?
Curious about the parallel of hunters. I mean, we don't require that somebody who has shot a deer eat it.
Yeah.
Many people do hunt for meat, but some people do for trophies. I wonder how hunters react to fish welfare.
So interesting. So down here, if you shoot a deer, you don't necessarily have to eat it.
You don't have to prove that you
You don't have to prove that you eat it. Okay. So there's typically flesh cannot be wasted rules that apply and are presumably followed for both fish actually and wildlife at least, unless you shoot squirrels or something, I presume, or a pest of some sort. There's some interesting parallels between rec fishing and hunting, but there's also some big differences as well. When hunting means different things to different people as well, and hunters change throughout their hunting career, if you will. So oftentimes by the end of one's hunting career, you're not doing that much, pulling on the trigger. You're actually out there enjoying nature and so on. It's not just about the kill and the food per se. We've thought about doing a contrast between rec fishing and hunting, but haven't ever really got around to it. So oftentimes the same people that hunt fish as well. So I guess failing to pull the trigger when you have something that you could shoot in your scope is sort of equivalent to a catch and release event.
So in places like Germany where they have
There's certainly specialized groups that do not comply. The specialized carp anglers in particular. So one of the photos I showed was actually Robert Arlinghaus with a huge carp. Oftentimes in Germany there'll be a single carp in a lake, and there'll be 10 tents set up, all fishing for it. And in the middle of the night, they'll be asleep, a bell will go off, and someone will jump up and fight that fish and land it. Everybody else will pack up their tents and go home because they caught Mary Beth, the carp. That fish will be released, and they would be chastised if it were not released, and that fish will be caught again and again and again. So in the specialized groups, not an issue, they tend to just simply not pay attention. But the public as a whole, I think, they tend to be a fairly law-abiding group from what I understand. So.
I tend to sort of horse my fish and land them as quickly as possible. Is there any data to suggest that landing fish quickly reduces sublethal effects or the chance of or increase their chance of survival?
Sure. So there's a challenge there too. So if you land a fish too quickly and you're trying to remove the hook, that fish will battle you, and it'll, you're going to be wrestling with that fish for some time, and you may even end up with a treble hook in your hand. So there is a bit of a trade-off. So I think it's about being reasonable. There's a vast amount of literature, not just catch and release, but just exercise physiology in general, that shows there's a relationship between duration of exercise and the extent of physiological disturbance, and therefore how long it takes to recover. All of these things on their own probably aren't a big deal. It's when they all come together. So it's the fight, coupled with air exposure, coupled with inappropriate revival techniques, doing it when the water temperature is 25 degrees and you've got a salmonid in your hand, that fish isn't going to do well. So it's really about, and so it's complex. It's not a simple message to the anglers or the angling community, but fight time does matter. Yes?
One of the things you touched on a little bit was the reality that anglers in general are pro-conservation, pro-restoration, pro-habitat protection, not all of them, but
yep.
As a community, but the public doesn't perceive them as such. Fishermen or anglers are a bunch of killers, etc. So what's your feeling about how do you change that attitude of the public about one of these benefits for them?
Yeah, and I'll take it one step further and say that their license fees pay, and the money, the Wallop Row and the DJ funds, so it funds the work, at least here in much of the work here in the U.S. I've been in Florida for the last few weeks, and I think there fishing is just so ingrained in part of the community that the general public, I think, does get it. There have been attempts to actually weave fishing into curriculum. The American Fisheries Society has, about 10 years back, had a committee that developed some materials that could be infused in. There are a lot of angler education programs directed at youth, I think. And if you look at angling participation rates, it's very much an aging population. So, and in general, participation rates are declining, but the absolute participation is increasing just because of human population growth. So, I worry that in a few years, when the old timers, hang up the rod, that we're not going to have the pulse of young folks coming up. So I think we're going down a path that it's going to even be more dire. So I guess I'd like to see some of those angling groups take a more proactive role and emphasizing the conservation, realizing that conservation isn't stocking necessarily, that it isn't building more boat ramps and access, or putting in rock structures to attract the fish to make them easier to catch. That's not conservation, although most fishing NGOs/advocacy groups, that's what they do for conservation, as opposed to a group like Trout Unlimited, which is very proactive in terms of lobbying for habitat protection and doing real systems-based restoration projects. I'd like to hope that there'd be more organizations like that in the future. Yes?
Is there any
complexity in regulations is definitely a factor. So if somebody picks up the telephone book, take regulation book, they can't figure out what they're supposed to do, so they simply say, I'm not going to do it. In wilderness areas, access has gotten much better, to the detriment of some fish populations. There tend to be urban fishing opportunities. They tend not to be very good, though. They tend to be quick rotate style fisheries. And a lot of people, especially the purist anglers, the specialized anglers, they're looking for more of a wilderness experience, something a little bit different. So, there certainly is an interest in urban angling, urban fishing opportunities, but they tend to be directed towards children. A dock with trash cans around it and a few public display signs, but really directed towards kids. So access is important. It needs to be easy for people to fish, but at the same time, that's also part of the problem. Julie?
No, I just had a follow-up comment to Daniel's question, is that I think part of the issue is that expecting anglers to be the voice of conservation or one of the stewards of conservation, I think is completely wrong. It's like they're promoting, instrumental values. And I would argue that, people like Jeremy Wade, River Monsters, Zed Hogan, or Mega Fishes are actually doing more harm than good with respect to the long-term conservation of our freshwater system. So, I think we need to look to a different group that currently doesn't exist with respect to promoting, in my opinion, the proper conservation of freshwater.
Good point. I would say that the media in general, especially the TV media, has done a very poor job of showing proper fish handling and the wrestling of these enigmatic species and so on. Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, another advocacy group in Florida, they've actually been monitoring the relevant media outlets, and they actually have sent letters to organizations that repeatedly show bonefish being held out of water or with obviously dry hands or put on a boat deck and so on. So there's some groups that get it, but you've also got sort of the scar of the Freedom to Fish Act that still sort of lingers there, where there's a group in the U.S. that believes that the access, the right to fish should be, I guess, a constitutional right. And basically, it's a way to try and counter the move towards protected areas, mostly in marine systems. But the belief that you should be able to fish anywhere and everywhere, as opposed to having some parts of our natural world that are completely inaccessible to fishing.
So a lot of what you've done has been talking about sort of survival of individual fish. Is there a separate literature that looks at sort of survival of fish populations based on whether or not there's sufficient recreational access? Because a lot of what's floating around here is the hypothesis that people could be supportive of recreational angling, and that makes them supportive of providing healthy ecosystems that support the angling. Have people looked at that question?
Yeah, so I think if I understand your question appropriately, it's really what the science behind harvest regulations are about, where there have been controlled experiments where you don't have harvest regulations on these 6 lakes, and you have a slot limit on these 6, and a minimum size limit on these 6 lakes, and so and that sort of has served as the basis, the scientific basis for selecting harvest regulation A, B, or C. And management agencies tends to be management agencies that do those experiments on a long temporal and fairly large spatial scale. And is that where you were going with your question?
I was thinking even potentially more broadly than that, where you might see cross-country comparisons where there's an active angling community in support of one type of, in support of having angling, and therefore there's a greater support for setting up state parks.
Right. Nothing that I'm aware of. Literature, I'm not overly familiar with either of those. So.
You touched very briefly on the issue of pain for
Yep.
sufferers. Where you said you had some experiments or some evidence that they didn't feel pain?
No. Okay, so right Right now, there's 7 or 8 papers that have come out of Europe, all which have gotten a lot of media attention, and even some coverage in Science picked it up and ran a story. And what we did is assembled a team of neurobiologists, physiologists, and a couple folks with an interest in rec fishing, and we conducted a very critical review of those papers, and we found a number of pretty serious flaws related to experimental design, manipulation of the definition as to what pain was. That's a biggie. So anybody can create an operational definition and then have it be consistent or inconsistent with their findings. But some of the biggest issues relate to the fact that, for example, fish, humans have something called C fibers, and they're the nociceptors that would respond to very serious